So the next section here, I'm on page 2 of our consonant handout here, section 3, is about manner of articulation. So what kind of a constriction are you creating in your vocal tract to make different kinds of consonant sounds? And this one's going to be a little bit more extensive, and so I might need to split this into several videos. Let's see how far I get. Okay, sorry, checking the time. Gotcha. So there are many different degrees and kinds of constrictions you can do. As I mentioned earlier, the least constricted sounds are vowels. They have, for the most part, the most open vocal tracts, generally the lowest jaw positions, and the least amount of aerodynamic constriction in that vocal tract. From those vowels, we can map out a continuum from the most open to the least open vocal tracts, or the least constricted to the most constricted vocal tracts. And so we could say that the consonants with the least constriction are the most vowel-like consonants, or sonorant consonants. And the consonants with the most constriction are the most consonantal, or the least vowel-like consonants. So that continuum is going to be kind of important in phonology. Yeah, and here's how I would do this. Again, breaking this into various levels of degree of constriction. Each of these levels is going to be somewhat important in this class. And so in the middle level here, there's sort of 3.5 levels. The one that has 2 categories is going to be obstruent versus sonorant. This turns out to be a pretty important distinction in many languages in the world. Obstruents are going to include all of the sounds that are made with a fairly closed vocal tract and a lot of turbulent, noisy airflow that results in noise, basically. So what is noise? Well, acoustically, noise is turbulent airflow that's chaotic and unpredictable. It's aperiodic, so it doesn't have a recurring waveform. And the way your ear hears noise is this very distinctive sort of high-pitched, well, I don't know what to call it other than noise, but all of these things are noise. Right? Those are all noise sounds. For those of you who are old enough to remember trying to tune in to a television station or a radio station, the sound that you get when you can't find the channel and you get this sort of sound, that's noise. Noise is totally unpredictable, chaotic airflow. And consonants with a noise component tend to be with a much narrower vocal tract. That's how you get noise. And that includes things like the stops, fricatives, and affricates. I'll go into more detail on each of these manners in the following sections. At the more vowel-like end of this continuum, on the right side here, are the sonorant consonants. And the term sonorant probably also includes vowels, although usually it's only used to refer to consonants. And a sonorant sound is just the opposite of an obstruent, or the complement of an obstruent. It's a sound made with no significant noise component. Right? And so that's going to include nasal sounds, which are sounds that are made with the oral and nasal cavities coupled to one another, as well as liquids, glides, and vowels. And those last 3 categories, liquids, glides, and vowels, have another name associated with them that's also useful to know, approximants. Right? So an approximant is a non-nasal sonorant. That's another way of putting it. The difference here is that nasals are made with a fully occluded vocal tract, but they don't create noise because there's no airflow through the oral part of the vocal tract. Whereas liquids, glides, and vowels are made with much wider constrictions that allow airflow through the oral cavity, but just not in a noisy manner. Right? So there's a slight difference between sonorants and approximants. They're both going to be highly relevant for phonology. And the difference is just that sonorants don't have any noise, while approximants are those made with constrictions so wide that they could never have noise. And that's why it excludes nasals. One more important category here that doesn't fit neatly on this continuum is the continuant category, and that's shown with these little lines on the bottom of the diagram. And a continuant is a sound made with continuous airflow through the oral cavity. So it's basically a sound where airflow through the oral cavity is not completely stopped. That's going to include fricatives, which have very narrow constrictions but still let airflow through those constrictions, as well as the approximants, which have very wide constriction and just freely allow air to flow through. So liquids, glides, and technically vowels, although again these consonant features are usually not used to talk about vowels. In general, we use different kinds of features of the type we looked at last week to characterize vowels. And so notably, things this excludes are oral stops, and these are sounds where you completely block airflow for some period of time in the oral cavity. It's going to exclude affricates, which we'll talk about a little bit later, which are like combinations of stops and fricatives. And it's going to exclude nasals because, again, air is flowing continuously in a nasal sound like m or n, except that airflow is through the nasal cavity, not through the oral cavity. There's no airflow through the oral cavity, so nasals are not considered continuants. So that's my sort of summary and overview. Now, the details. Right? And so I might break this up into several videos, but let's start section 3.1 here with approximants. Right? So I've defined approximants here as sounds for which two articulators form a constriction, but not a constriction narrow enough to cause turbulent, noisy airflow. That turbulent, noisy airflow that I've mentioned several times is referred to in linguistics as frication. Right? So these are all frication sounds in different languages. And so what is this going to include? Well, the glides and liquids. And in English, I'll explain glides and liquids in a moment. In English, the sounds that fit in here are going to be r, l, w, and y. These are going to be the liquids, r and l, and the glides, w and y. So starting from the most vowel-like first, what are glides? Glides are basically the consonant version of vowels, right? So y is essentially exactly the same as the vowel e, but it's a consonant version of the vowel e. W is basically exactly like the vowel u, except it's a consonant version of that vowel. Right? So why do we actually have different symbols for the glides w and y than we do for the vowels u and e? Well, it might be for phonetic reasons. So it might be that these glides have shorter duration than their vowel counterparts, or that they're not as loud as their vowel counterparts. There's some evidence that both of those things might be true in English. It's not clear whether that's true in every language where people have written these as glides, but that's one possibility. I think it's more likely that we use these different symbols, even though these are acoustically and articulatorily very similar, to u and e. We usually use these labels for phonological reasons. And the claim here is that glides are the form that vowels take when they are not the heads of their own syllables. Those heads of syllables are also called the nucleus or nuclei of syllables. And so the claim here is that when you write the English second person pronoun you, where this one is a glide but this one is a vowel, the claim here is that yes, the beginning of this word might look exactly like the English vowel e, but this sound is the head of the syllable, and this sound is not. So we write the non-head one as a consonant, as a glide. Right? So again, the difference between glides and vowels is a little bit confusing. It's often more of a phonological analysis than it is an actual phonetic distinction. There may also be phonetic correlates, but they're subtle and they probably differ between languages. And the claim is that in a language like English, when you have two vowel-like sounds like this adjacent with one another, it's mostly predictable in phonological terms which one's going to be the head and which one's going to be the non-head of the syllable. Right? So it's a phonological pattern or a phonological rule here. Similarly, the claim would be that if you have something that's going to be phonetically almost identical, that starts with an E-like quality and ends with a U-like quality. The claim is that in English, this is not a possible way to parse that syllable. And the phonetic distinction between these, it's hard to say. If I tried really hard, I could produce something like you, 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 you. That's, you know, a little bit iffy. But yeah, this is more of a phonological distinction than a phonetic one. These two glides, w and y, tend to be cross-linguistically the two most frequent glides. And you know, it's a little bit speculative. We're not sure that we know the exact reason why, but one thing to note is that E and U are two of the most common high vowels in the world's languages as well. So if you're going to have some consonant versions of some vowels, E and U are going to be high vowels, meaning that you have a high jaw, so they're going to be more similar to consonants already. And they're going to be very, very common cross-linguistically, so it's likely that you would pick one or both of these vowels to make consonant versions of. Right? So, y, as I mentioned earlier, is a palatal sound made with your tongue blade or maybe body up near your hard palate. W is interesting because it's the only consonant in English, at least, that's said to have two places of articulation. And it's referred to as labiovelar, meaning lips and soft palate over here. Why is that? Well, it's because it's a consonant version of this vowel oo. Oo, if you remember from the vowel section, is a high back vowel, meaning that the tongue body is going to be raised and back a little bit near the velum, so that's why it has a velar constriction. And it's a rounded vowel, which means that your two lips are going to be protruded, making this round shape, and that's what makes it labial. So it has both a labial constriction and a velar one. That's because it's really more like a vowel in some ways than it is like a consonant. So that's labiovelar glide wa. In the English consonant chart and in your textbook, you might see mention of a voiceless version of this, which is written as an upside down W character. This is very marginal in most varieties of English, of contemporary English, and it usually corresponds in the spelling system to this digraph sequence of two letters, WH. And so a lot of words that are written this way for historical reasons in English have an optional variant that's a voiceless wa. And so this would be pronunciations like what, which, why, or something like that. You will sometimes hear these in hyper-correct or hyper-formal English, but it's really not a part of most people's everyday spoken English. One interesting exception is that there are some rural variants and southern variants of American English where these are actually quite productive. So you do find this as a kind of preserved feature in some regional varieties of English. But in general, sort of mainstream American English, this is pretty rarely preserved. Usually these are just pronounced with this glide, wa. There is a hilarious episode of The Family Guy where the baby who talks with an English accent overgeneralizes this to any word in English that's spelled this way. And it confuses the family dog who also talks. It's a pretty funny episode. If you're interested, look up Family Guy Cool Whip or Cool Whip. It's pretty funny. So those are the glides of English. English also has liquids. Liquid is a sort of ambiguous and fuzzy category, but basically it's going to be an approximant, so a sound with a relatively wide constriction, with no immediately obvious vowel counterpart, right? And which often involves complex secondary articulations, right? So this is going to be true in most languages where we talk about liquids. They're going to be this kind of a sound where you can't just look at the sound and be like, oh, that's the consonant version of an E, right? They have no obvious vowel counterparts, and there's often some extremely complex things going on with the vocal tract. And so, for instance, in English, the L sound is an alveolar lateral approximant, and that lateral feature is going to be, again, one of these complex secondary articulations that deals with the shape of the tongue rather than the place of articulation. And so you'll see this in some charts listed as a place of articulation. In other charts it might be listed as a manner of articulation. It's not exactly either. It has to do with the overarching shape of the tongue. So basically, in a lateral l sound in English, you're going to have a near closure or possibly complete closure with your tongue tip touching or almost touching your alveolar ridge, except, unlike a stop consonant, the sides of your tongue blade just behind your alveolar ridge are going to be lowered, right? They're going to be sort of let down, the sides of your tongue. And so instead of blocking airflow, air will flow freely around the sides of the constriction that you make at your alveolar ridge. And this changes pretty radically the sound involved. It changes the resonant frequencies, which in turn you perceive as a different consonant sound. English, interestingly, seems to also have a separate tongue body thing going on with this l sound that's going to be something like a mid-back dorsal constriction, so a little bit like the vowel or something like that. That also seems to be associated with the l sound in English. Nonetheless, we talk about this usually as being a coronal sound, an alveolar sound, an alveolar lateral approximant. So again, complex secondary things going on here, and no obvious vowel counterpart. Most varieties of American English feature at least two different kinds of l, but as American English native speakers, we are trained not to hear these because they are not contrastive. In general, at the beginning of a word, you get what's sometimes called a clear or a light l sound. For instance, the minimal pair I've given here is lute versus tool. And the claim is that the two l sounds in those two words are really, really different from one another, even if you don't immediately hear that as an American English speaker. That clear or light one generally has the tongue tip part of the sound, the lateral part, precedes whatever you're doing with your tongue body, that secondary articulation. Whereas the complementary category here, the dark L or dark L sound, tends to occur in word final position or maybe in syllable final position in American English, as in the last sound in tool. Right? So let me give you that minimal pair again. See if you can hear the difference in the L's here. If you're a native Spanish or Russian speaker or French, you can probably hear this pretty easily because the light one is a lot like the l sound in those languages, and the l one is quite different. Actually, I should have said for Russian speakers, which I don't know if we have any this year, it's actually the dark l that's more like the plain Russian lateral sound, not the palatalized one. So in general, this is going to sound like this: lute, tool. And if I were going to try to produce these by themselves, I would say la, ol, le. You can hear that those are quite different. The difference, as I mentioned, in the light one, usually the tongue tip part is preceding the tongue body part, whereas in the dark one, you tend to get this tongue body movement happening before the tongue tip movement is complete, and it has a very different sound. Sometimes written, that dark variant, with this little crossbar through it, or it's a cross tilde, and that stands for a velarized lateral approximant. That is the default sound for the lateral approximant in Russian, interestingly. But Russian also has a different variant. It's not the same as our light L, instead it's a palatal or palatalized L. Other common kinds of lateral approximants that you find in many different languages include the palatal lateral approximant, yeah. So you can get this in Italian. There's a clitic in Italian. It's I think it's the third person plural, or possibly even, it's the third person plural, clitic, and it's gli, right? And so this is made with a palatal constriction and a lateral constriction in it. You can get retroflex lateral approximants like la. And so there are some examples here from Tamil, which is a Dravidian language spoken in the south of India and Sri Lanka. And yeah, so this is going to be a lateral sound that's made with air escaping over the sides of the tongue. But in the retroflex version, again, the tongue tip is going to be brought backwards, somewhere behind the alveolar ridge. And so there are minimal pairs here. This is contrastive in Tamil. And so my best attempt to pronounce these words, this is probably not going to be perfect, but would be the word on the left for tiger would be something like puli, and the word on the right for sour or for tamarind would be something like pulli, 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 pulli. Not so easy to hear for somebody whose language doesn't have retroflexion contrasts, and that's going to be true for all contrasts between retroflex and non-retroflex sounds. These are quite difficult to hear if your language doesn't have such contrast. Of course, for people who speak Tamil, it's not hard to hear at all. Right? There's another minimal pair here, val versus val, tail versus sword. And again, this is my best attempt at producing these contrasts. I don't speak Tamil, and so these are probably not perfect pronunciations. The other liquid in English is this mysterious or r sound. And the technically correct way to write this is with an upside down R symbol. In general, if we're talking about English in class, because this is the only like sound that exists in American English, and it's just easier to write it normally, I'm usually going to use the right side up R symbol for this, and you're welcome to do so as well, unless it's super important that this is the particular weird sound that it is. In the IPA, this normal R letter is the symbol for the apical trill that you find in languages like Spanish, Italian, and Russian. Which I can't pronounce, so I'm not going to try. But that's what this really stands for. In practice, we often use this in transcribing English because we know that it's not going to be an apical trill in English, possible exception of some areas in Scotland, right? We just don't have this sound in English. And so in general, I'll usually write it this way. Here, where I'm talking about the detailed phonetics of this sound, I'm going to try to be careful in the handout about using the right symbol here. Okay, so you consult 5 different textbooks that might tell you 5 different things about what this sound is like. It's some kind of a coronal approximant, so some kind of an approximant made using the front of the tongue, but there's tons of variability and complexity in how this sound is actually produced. So you'll sometimes see this categorized as a retroflex sound. And that would indicate that some speakers in some positions pronounce the sound with their tongue tip curled back a little bit. That's generally not going to be as true for English as it is for languages with real retroflex contrasts like Tamil, which we just looked at. The retroflexion is never going to be as radical in English as it is in one of those languages, but retroflex is a possible way of producing this. That said, other speakers produce it with what's called a bunched tongue tip, where rather than curling the tip of the tongue back, you sort of make the tongue more massive in the front. And that's another possibility. Many speakers have lip rounding that accompanies this sound in English. So you noticed me before saying that the shape of your lips in certain sounds is round. There's my lips rounding for the sound, which is kind of funny because it's not noted as a labial or a round sound, but often you get some degree of lip rounding with this sound in English. In the phonology, it generally patterns in ways we'll see shortly in this class as a post-alveolar consonant like ch or ja or zha or sha. That tends to have the same place of articulation as those sounds and not as an alveolar one in English, although I think, well, no, this is just a generic symbol for a coronal approximant. I would say that this is post-alveolar in English in terms of place of articulation. Many different possible ways to write this. The technically correct one is the upside down R. I will often just use the plain R because it's easy. There is a special IPA symbol for a coronal retroflex approximant. That's with this little upside down R with the little hook on it, right? And, you know, it's probably not wrong to use that for the English sound, so use that if you want to. It really doesn't matter as long as we understand that we're talking about the same sound. On the right side of page 3 of the handout, I've shown you just some of the variability that's associated with this sound in English. So this is X-ray tracings from 4 different speakers. I think this is research by Sam Perkel and colleagues in Cambridge at Mass General Hospital. And they're showing you different speakers pronouncing different kinds of sounds in American English with different tongue shapes. And so in each of these pictures, what you're seeing is the lips on the left, and then there's like a solid line across the top. That's the roof of the mouth. And then there's these squiggly lines with a white blob outlining a light blob below them, and that's the tongue in these X-ray images. And so what you can see here is that some of these, as in, which ones would be good examples here? Like the right one under C, next to the letters PK, that's more retroflex. You can see the tongue tip sort of sticking back a little bit. Similarly, under D, the bottom one here, you can see the tip of the tongue is sort of back. That's more retroflex. The bunched tongue, is shown on the left side of row C here. And that's where, rather than sort of taking the tip and doing anything with it, it looks like they've scrunched up the tongue into a kind of dome shape that goes up near the area behind the alveolar ridge. That's what we mean by bunched tongue. And you'll look at these 7 different tracings and find 7 really different tongue shapes that all correspond to an sound in English. Right? English interestingly, can also function as a vowel. It can be the head of a syllable. And these have special notations as well. So in an unstressed syllable, where it's a schwa-like vowel with an quality, you'll see this written with the schwa symbol and this little R subscript coming off of it. So this is the unstressed as in worker. Sorry, that is not helpful at all. The second syllable of worker, which is unstressed, would be written this way. And then the stressed version, which is really unlike any other English stressed vowel, will generally be written like this. I'm trying to remember if the little tail comes off the top or the bottom. It's the top. So this is the first vowel sound in worker because it's stressed, and this is the second one because it's unstressed. So basically, this is going to be like a mid-central vowel, like a schwa, but with rhotic coloring, whatever that means. You're doing some of the same things with the front of your tongue that you would be in a raw consonant sound, and articulatorily, in terms of X-ray tracings like the ones up here, it's very complex, and there's several different ways to get there. The ones that say syllabic R in those X-ray tracings, those are the vowel versions here. I don't know whether they're stressed or unstressed, but you can see that those 2 tongue positions for the 2 sounds are really radically different for the 2 speakers. So that's going to be quite complex. Cross-linguistically, these sounds are sometimes referred to as rhotics. Rhotic just means that they're sounds written with the letter R in different languages. And given that that's based on accidents of history, which countries, which languages happen to have specific writing systems that use characters that look like this, right? It's not clear whether the category rhotic, let me put this in quotes to show that it's a letter, it's not clear whether the category rhotic is actually a real linguistic category or whether it's just sort of an artifact of history and of writing systems. Either way, people tend to use this term rhotic to talk about different kinds of liquids that are written with R characters, and it really has a tremendous amount of heterogeneity. So I'm showing you some examples from Peter Ladefoged's textbook on consonants and vowels with different kinds of sounds that are considered rhotics. And this is mostly in European languages. There's a couple Hausa examples here. That's definitely not Indo-European. But yeah, just even within these examples, you can see some of the variation. There are audio files on the website that link to some of these sounds if you want to hear more accurate versions of them. I'm going to do my best with some of these. We already mentioned the other day, I believe, the contrast between the tap and the trill in Spanish. So Spanish has two sounds that are written with R letters. One of them is an extremely, one of them is a trill that's made by holding the tongue body again somewhere near the alveolar ridge and creating conditions behind it that allow that tongue tip to vibrate. And so this is the one I can't pronounce, but it's something like perro, with imagine me actually successfully completing that trill. Spanish also has another R sound that might be a shorter version of the trill that's referred to as a tap, and that's the sound as in pero. So these mean two different things in English. The first one, which I can't pronounce, means dog. The second one means but, like the interjection but. In Hausa, you can see here, Hausa is a language spoken in, I want to say Senegal, but I could be wrong about that. You get a distinction between two kinds of taps. There's an apical tap, or a tongue tip tap, as in para, and those accent marks on the vowels are tone. Para, versus a retroflex tap, which is in the word for para, right? And you can hear audio of these on the Course in Phonetics website. In English, we have this weird alveolar approximant, as in red. Sometimes it's retroflex, as in red. Very hard to hear the difference. There's a good reason for that, which we might talk about later in the class. In Czech, there's this unusual voiced alveolar fricative trill. I also can't really pronounce this one, but it's going to be something like dřeka. Right? It's halfway between a j and a trill. In mainstream northern metropolitan French, like in Paris, that last example here, at the beginning of a word before a vowel, you'll generally find that this is a voiced uvular fricative, as in rouge. In extremely old-fashioned, sort of stereotypical versions of French, especially that associated with the singer Edith Piaf. Also, apparently in Provençal French, spoken in the south of the country, this can be a uvular trill, a rouge. Right? That's very old-fashioned. You don't normally find that in modern, contemporary Parisian French. And the French one can also take on devoiced versions. If you put it after a voiceless consonant, you get a devoiced version of it. So yeah, lots and lots of variation in these rhotic sounds. Not clear that there's any phonetic or phonological unity to the class of rhotics. It might just be a convenient label we use for things that happen to be written with R in the writing system. So I'll split the other manners of articulation out into separate videos.